The lawyer slid the folder across the table, and my mother didn't even wait for him to finish reading before she smiled at my sister like the whole thing had already been decided years ago. "The house, the savings, the lake property," she said. "All of it goes to Renee. That's final." She didn't look at me once. What none of us knew yet was that 2 days earlier, in the crawlspace behind my grandfather's old workshop, a contractor clearing out the property for sale had found a rusted floor safe nobody in our family had ever mentioned. And what was inside it was about to make my mother's final decision the least final thing that had happened in our family in 30 years. My name is Claire Donnelly, and for most of my life I believed the story my mother told about our family was simply the truth, the way children believe gravity is the truth, without ever questioning who decided it should work that way. The story was this. My older sister Renee was the responsible one, the one who stayed close to home, who called every Sunday, who showed up. I was the one who left. I moved 4 states away at 22 to take a nursing job in Denver, and in my mother's telling, that single decision had apparently settled, once and for all, which daughter actually loved her. What the story left out was that I called every Sunday too. It left out that I had flown back for every surgery, every holiday, every crisis, on a nurse's salary that made the flights hurt more than my mother ever seemed to notice. It left out that Renee, for all her physical proximity, had spent the better part of 15 years quietly positioning herself as the only daughter who mattered. In ways so subtle I hadn't fully understood the shape of them until the day we sat in Harold Fenwick's law office to read my grandfather's will. Grandpa Walt had died 11 weeks earlier, 86 years old, a quiet, sharp-eyed man who had built a modest but real fortune running a hardware supply business out of a single warehouse for 40 years. He had never remarried after my grandmother passed, never spent extravagantly, and never in my entire life said a cross word to either of his granddaughters. I had loved him uncomplicated and completely, the way you love the one adult in your childhood who never made you feel like you had to earn your place at the table. The will reading happened on a gray Tuesday in October, in a conference room that smelled like printer toner and old coffee. My mother Diane seated at the head of the table like she was chairing the meeting rather than attending it. Harold Fenwick, Grandpa's longtime attorney, a careful man in his 60s with reading glasses perched low on his nose, opened the folder slowly. "The estate is fairly straightforward," he said. "The house on Birchwood Lane, the lake cabin, and the bulk of the liquid savings, approximately $420,000, are to be divided equally between Diane's 2 daughters, Claire and Renee Donnelly, in accordance with Walter's wishes as expressed in this document." I felt something in my chest loosen for the first time in months. Equal. Grandpa had made it equal. My mother's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "That can't be right," she said. "Walt told me directly more than once that he wanted the bulk of it to go to Renee, given everything she's done to help around here." Harold looked at her over his glasses. "Diane, I drafted this will personally 18 months before he passed and reviewed it with him again 4 months before his death." He was lucid, decisive, and very specific. "It's equal." "Well, he changed his mind," my mother said, and there was something in her voice that I recognized but hadn't yet learned to name as fear. "He told me so himself. He wanted it weighted toward Renee. I assumed there'd be a more recent document." There wasn't, according to Harold, but 3 weeks later there suddenly was. My mother arrived at the next family meeting with a single typed page, dated 4 months before Grandpa's death, stating that he wished to leave 70% of the estate to Renee in recognition of her, quote, "ongoing care and presence." It was signed at the bottom in a shaky version of my grandfather's handwriting, notarized by a man none of us had ever heard of, at a notary office 2 towns away from the one Grandpa had used his entire life. I looked at that signature for a long time. My grandfather had a particular old-fashioned way of writing his W's, a flourish he'd had since I was a child watching him sign checks at the kitchen table. The signature on that page had a different W. It was close. It was close enough that, on its own, in a vacuum, I might have believed it. But I had spent 28 years watching that man sign his name, and something in me, quiet and certain, said this is wrong before my brain had even finished cataloging why. "Mom," I said carefully at that second meeting, "where did this come from? Why didn't Harold have it?" "Because your grandfather gave it to me directly," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. "He didn't trust lawyers near the end. He wanted it kept private until I felt the time was right." Renee said nothing. She sat very still, the way she always did when something delicate was happening that she didn't want to disturb, and I watched my sister, the sister I had grown up sharing a bedroom with, the The sister whose hand I had held through our parents' divorce when we were both still in elementary school refused to look directly at me even once. Harold, to his credit, did not simply accept the document. "This needs to be authenticated before anything changes," he said. A handwritten addendum surfacing this late, outside the original execution, notarized by an office Walter never used in his life. The court is going to want answers, not assumptions. My mother bristled at the delay, but agreed mostly, I think, because she didn't yet understand how thin the ice beneath that page actually was. For 6 weeks, the estate sat frozen in legal limbo while a forensic document examiner Harold retained ran her tests. I went back to Denver. I worked my shifts. I called my mother every Sunday, the way I always had, and every Sunday she found a new way to remind me, gently, almost lovingly, that Renee had simply done more, been more, deserved more, a slow campaign of small cruelties dressed up as fairness. And I began to understand, with a kind of cold clarity, that this had probably been happening to me my entire life, just never with $400,000 attached to make it undeniable. Then the contractor found the safe. The lake property had been listed for sale as part of settling the estate, regardless of who would eventually own which share of it, and a contractor named Mike Brennan had been hired to clear out the old workshop behind the cabin before showings began. Behind a panel of warped plywood in the crawl space, bolted into the concrete foundation, he found a small, fireproof floor safe, rusted at the hinges, clearly untouched in years. He called Harold instead of my mother, which turned out to matter more than anyone realized at the time, because Harold, as the estate's executor, was the only person with the legal authority to open it in a way that would hold up if its contents ever mattered. They didn't open it right away. It took another locksmith, another week, and a quiet afternoon in Harold's office with myself, Renee, and my mother all present, per Harold's insistence that nothing from that safe would be examined privately by anyone. Inside were 3 things. The first was a small leather ledger, my grandfather's handwriting filling every page, tracking decades of small loans and gifts he'd quietly given to family members over the years. The kind of record keeping a careful man does when he doesn't entirely trust his own memory to be fair later. The second was a sealed envelope addressed, in that same unmistakable handwriting with that same particular W, to my attorney, Harold Fenwick, to be opened only by him, regarding my estate. The third was a stack of cash, $11,000, with a note clipped to it that simply read, "For emergencies, split between the girls, they'll know when." Harold opened the sealed envelope there in front of all of us, exactly as instructed. It was a letter dated only 7 months before Grandpa's death, more recent than the will and far more recent than the typed page my mother had produced. In it, my grandfather, in plain, careful language, explained that he had grown concerned, in his final year, that someone might attempt to alter his wishes after he was gone, because he had, quote, "noticed things in this family I don't like, particularly concerning how my granddaughter Claire is spoken about when she isn't in the room." He had hidden the original signed will codicil he'd actually intended, confirming the equal split Harold already had on file, along with this letter in the safe, specifically because he no longer fully trusted that paperwork left in the house would stay untouched. "If anyone produces a different document after I'm gone," the letter read, "weighted differently than what Harold already has, I want it examined carefully because I did not write it." The room went very quiet. My mother's face had gone the particular shade of gray that comes not from grief, but from the specific, sinking knowledge that the floor you've been standing on for weeks was never real. Renee, beside her, had started, almost imperceptibly, to cry, and I understood in that moment, watching her, that she had known. Maybe not from the very beginning, but at some point she had understood exactly what that typed page was and had said nothing because silence, for the second time in our family's life, had been the only thing weighted in her favor. "Diane," Harold said, and his voice had lost every trace of the careful courtesy he'd shown her for 11 weeks. "I'm going to need to ask you directly. Where did the addendum you brought me actually come from?" My mother didn't answer right away. When she finally did, her voice had no fight left in it at all. "Renee found someone," she said quietly. "A man who does this kind of thing. He matched the handwriting from old letters. I told myself it didn't matter because I knew Walt would have wanted it that way eventually. He just never got around to actually doing it." "He got around to it," Harold said, sliding my grandfather's letter and the original codicil across the table. 18 months before he died, and again 7 months before he died, specifically because he was worried this exact thing might happen. He didn't fail to update his wishes, Diane. He hid them from you because on some level he already knew. The consequences arrived with the particular unglamorous slowness of family law rather than the swift theater of a criminal courtroom, but they arrived completely. Harold reported the forged addendum to the probate court immediately, and the matter was referred for a fraud investigation. The forger Renee had paid, a disbarred former paralegal running a quiet side business out of a strip mall office 2 towns over, was charged criminally within the month, and in exchange for a reduced sentence, he confirmed in a sworn statement exactly who had hired him and paid him, in cash, $8,000 to manufacture a document timed to surface after Grandpa's death. Renee was charged as well for forgery and attempted fraud upon the probate court, and though her attorney negotiated the charge down to a lesser offense given her clean record, she was left with a felony conviction, a 5-figure restitution order, and a probationary period that would follow her for years. My mother was not charged criminally. She had not commissioned the forgery herself, but Harold formally reported her conduct to the court as well, and the judge overseeing the estate ordered the full equal division of the estate exactly as my grandfather's authenticated documents specified, with an additional finding that attorneys' fees incurred fighting the fraudulent claim be paid entirely out of what would have been Renee's share. I didn't celebrate any of it. There is no version of watching your sister cry in a probate court that feels like winning, even when you know you were right the entire time. What I felt instead, sitting in that gray little courtroom months later while the judge read the final order, was something closer to grief finally being allowed to finish. The specific grief of understanding that my grandfather had seen something true about our family that none of us had been willing to say out loud while he was alive, and had quietly, carefully, made sure the truth would survive him even if his own daughter wouldn't carry it forward honestly. My mother and I are not close now, not the way we once were. We speak, occasionally, carefully, the way people speak across a distance that used to be smaller. Renee and I have not spoken at all since the day that safe was opened, though I think about her more than I expected to, mostly with a tired kind of sadness rather than anger. I used my half of the estate to put a down payment on a small house outside Denver, the first home I've ever owned, and I keep my grandfather's leather ledger on a shelf in the living room, not because I need it for anything, but because it is, in its quiet, careful handwriting, the truest thing my family ever produced about itself. He used to tell me when I was small that the truth doesn't need anyone to defend it. It just needs somewhere safe to wait. I didn't understand what he meant until a contractor cleared out an old workshop and found exactly that. If this story of a hidden safe, a forged document, and a grandfather who saw the truth before anyone else would say it out loud moved you, please like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear that the truth has a way of surviving, even when the people closest to it try to bury it. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story.